The Revolutionary War. It began as a spark in a small Massachusetts town, but the Revolutionary War quickly became a full-blown inferno that changed the world. The British Empire, the most powerful military on Earth, found itself fighting farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants who refused to kneel. The colonies had been taxed, restricted, and ignored for years, until they finally snapped. When shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the dream of freedom went from whispers in taverns to blood on the streets. George Washington, a man with more grit than experience, took command of a ragtag Continental Army that was outgunned, underfed, and constantly on the run. But what the Americans lacked in power, they made up for in defiance. Every British victory came with a heavy cost, and every American defeat only made their cause stronger. The turning point came at Saratoga in 1777, where a battered American force handed Britain a stunning loss that convinced France to join the fight. Suddenly, the rebellion had teeth and global stakes. 2 years later, the brutal winter at Valley Forge hardened Washington's army into professionals. By 1781, at Yorktown, British General Cornwallis found himself surrounded by American and French forces. He surrendered, and with that, an empire lost its colonies. The 1783 Treaty of Paris sealed the deal. America was free. But freedom wasn't simple. The war left tens of thousands dead, a nation in debt, and ideals that were still incomplete. Liberty for some, not yet all. Yet it was the beginning of a radical experiment. A country born not from bloodlines, but from belief. The world had never seen anything like it, and the British weren't the last to challenge it, because within a generation, America would find itself once again at war, with the same empire it just escaped. The War of 1812. The War of 1812 is often called America's forgotten war, but it was anything but forgettable. It was revenge dressed as patriotism, a second showdown with Britain that tested whether the young nation could survive. The spark came from years of British interference at sea. They were stopping American ships, seizing cargo, and forcing American sailors into the Royal Navy. To make matters worse, Britain was supplying Native American resistance in the Northwest Territory. The US had had enough. Led by President James Madison and a Congress full of fiery war hawks, America declared war in June 1812, hoping to prove itself on the world stage and maybe even conquer Canada. But reality hit hard. The invasions failed, Washington, D.C. was burned to the ground, and the capital's most famous symbol, the White House, was left in ashes. Yet even as the British marched through the capital, Americans refused to surrender. Naval heroes like Oliver Hazard Perry turned the tide on the Great Lakes, shouting, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." The Battle of Baltimore inspired Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner as bombs lit up the night sky. And in the war's chaotic final act, Andrew Jackson led a scrappy army to victory at New Orleans, unaware that a peace treaty had already been signed weeks earlier. The Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war, restoring borders but settling little else. Still, America emerged more confident than ever. It had stood toe-to-toe with an empire and didn't break. National pride exploded, industry boomed, and the world started to take the United States seriously. It wasn't about land or loot, it was about legitimacy. And though Britain walked away unbothered, America walked away reborn. But expansion and pride came with a dangerous side effect: ambition. And that ambition would soon turn the country's eyes south, toward Mexico. The Mexican-American War. By the 1840s, America was restless. The belief in manifest destiny, that the US was destined to control the continent, had become gospel. When Texas joined the Union in 1845, Mexico saw it as theft, not statehood. The border between the two nations was a ticking time bomb. President James K. Polk wanted land, California, New Mexico, and everything in between. And he was willing to push Mexico into a fight to get it. In April 1846, blood was spilled along the Rio Grande, and Polk declared that American blood has been shed on American soil. The war that followed was brutal but one-sided. U.S. forces led by Generals Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott crushed the Mexican army in a string of victories that showcased the might of the young republic. Taylor became a national hero at Buena Vista, while Scott captured Veracruz, then marched straight into Mexico City itself. In less than 2 years, the United States had done what European powers had failed to do: defeat Mexico on its own soil. The 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war and forced Mexico to cede nearly half its territory, including present-day California, Arizona, and Utah. America had gained its dream, but at a cost. The new land reopened the country's most explosive issue, slavery. Would the new territories allow it? That single question divided the nation and set the stage for a far bloodier conflict. The Mexican-American War gave America land, gold, and power, but it also gave it a curse. The victory planted the seeds of the Civil War, and the country's greatest internal battle was already brewing. But before the Union would tear itself apart, it would first have to learn what Union truly meant. The American Civil War. It wasn't just a war between states, it was a war for the soul of America. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, 11 southern states decided they'd rather break away than accept a president who opposed slavery's expansion. They formed the Confederate States of America, claiming states' rights, but everyone knew what that really meant: preserving human bondage. In April 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the country split in two. The Union had more men, more factories, and more railroads, but the Confederacy had something powerful too: conviction. They were fighting for a way of life they refused to lose. What followed was 4 years of unrelenting carnage. Battles like Antietam, Shiloh, and Gettysburg turned entire towns into graveyards. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, transforming the war into a fight for freedom, not just unity. That same year, Union forces took control of the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, cutting the Confederacy in half. By 1865, General Ulysses S. Grant's relentless campaign cornered Robert E. Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrendered. The Union had been saved, but at a staggering cost. Over 600,000 Americans dead. Cities lay in ruins, families were shattered, and the country was traumatized. Yet out of the ashes, a new America was born, one without slavery, but far from equal. Reconstruction would prove that healing a nation is harder than winning a war. The Civil War ended chains, but it didn't end hate. And while the North celebrated victory, another battle for justice had only begun. Still, America was changing, and the next war would mark its debut as a global power: the Spanish-American War. The year was 1898, and America was ready to flex its muscles on the world stage. For decades, Spain's empire had been crumbling, and Cuba's fight for independence caught America's attention and its sympathy. When the USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, killing over 260 sailors, the public cried out for vengeance. "Remember the Maine? To hell with Spain," became the rallying cry that launched the Spanish-American War. It was short, fierce, and decisive. In the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey obliterated the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay, while in Cuba, Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders charged up San Juan Hill in a battle that turned him into a national hero. But behind the glory was a darker truth. The US wasn't just fighting for Cuba's freedom, it was fighting for influence. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed, Spain had lost its last colonies, handing over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. For the first time, America had overseas territories and the beginnings of an empire. The victory was intoxicating, but it came with moral consequences. In the Philippines, American forces soon found themselves suppressing another independence movement, the very thing they had claimed to champion. The Spanish-American War was the moment America stopped being a regional power and started being a global one. It was quick, triumphant, and controversial, but that taste of empire was only the beginning, because the next conflict would drag America into a fight that no one on Earth could escape: World War I. When World War I erupted in 1914, America watched from a distance. The trenches of Europe were filled with chaos, gas, mud, and endless death. But President Woodrow Wilson insisted on neutrality. That changed when German submarines started sinking ships with Americans aboard. And the infamous Zimmerman telegram revealed a German plot to lure Mexico into attacking the US. In 1917, Wilson declared war, saying the world must be made safe for democracy. Over 4 million Americans were sent overseas to fight in a nightmare of barbed wire and mustard gas. General John J. Pershing led the American Expeditionary Forces through battles like Cantigny, San Miguel, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, massive, grinding campaigns that broke the stalemate and pushed Germany to the brink. Back home, the war transformed society. Women entered the workforce, African Americans moved north in the Great Migration, and propaganda fueled unity and fear. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, America emerged victorious and confident. But it wasn't just about victory, it was about power. Wilson dreamed of a League of Nations to prevent future wars, but Congress rejected it, fearing foreign entanglements. The United States retreated into isolation, convinced it could stay above the world's chaos. But that peace peace was an illusion. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany so harshly that resentment festered, planting the seeds for something far worse. America had joined the world stage, but it hadn't yet learned what it meant to lead it, and that lesson would come in fire and in global devastation. But first, only cool people are subscribed to this channel, so hit that subscribe button before we go any further. World War II. If World War I made America a player, World War II made it a superpower. The conflict erupted in 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, but the United States tried to stay out of it. That changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, killing more than 2,400 Americans in a single morning. Overnight, isolationism vanished, and the country went to war with both Japan and Germany. Factories roared to life. The draft swelled the ranks, and America became the arsenal of democracy. On the European front, US forces stormed beaches from North Africa to Normandy, pushing Hitler's armies back toward Berlin. In the Pacific, brutal battles like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa showed the world just how determined both sides were to win. Every island came at a staggering cost. But in August 1945, President Harry Truman made the most controversial decision in military history, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, and the war was over. More than 400,000 Americans had died, but the victory was absolute. The United States emerged as a global leader with unmatched military and industrial strength. Yet the triumph came with a shadow. The nuclear age had begun, and tensions with the Soviet Union were already forming. The world wasn't at peace, it was just holding its breath. The next battles wouldn't be fought for land alone, but for ideology. The Cold War was beginning, and America was about to face its first major test in Korea. The Korean War. In 1950, the peace that followed World War II shattered when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. Backed by the Soviet Union and later China, the North sought to unify the peninsula under communism. The United States, operating under the newly formed United Nations, responded immediately. President Truman called it a police action, but it quickly became a full-scale war. US troops under General Douglas MacArthur launched a daring amphibious assault at Incheon that flipped the momentum and pushed deep into North Korea. But just as victory seemed close, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers stormed across the Yalu River, driving UN forces back in one of the most brutal winters in military history. Battles like Chosin Reservoir tested the limits of endurance, as American Marines fought through freezing temperatures and encirclement to escape. After years of seesaw fighting, the front stabilized near the original border. In 1953, an armistice was signed, ending active combat but not the war itself. The 38th parallel remained, dividing two nations that are still technically at war today. Nearly 36,000 Americans were killed, and millions of Koreans perished. The conflict introduced a harsh new reality. The Cold War wasn't just political, it was deadly. And it wouldn't be the last time America intervened to stop the spread of communism. The next one would drag on for 2 decades and become the most divisive war in modern US history, the Vietnam War. Vietnam started as a whisper, a small advisory mission to help the South fight communist insurgents. But by the 1960s, it had become a full-blown quagmire. The US saw North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, as a threat in the global chess game of the Cold War. If one country fell to communism, they believed others would follow. The infamous domino theory. By 1965, America had more than 100,000 troops in Vietnam. It was a war fought in jungles and villages against an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. Guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and booby traps made every step dangerous. Operations like Rolling Thunder rained bombs across the north, but it wasn't enough to break their will. The Viet Cong fought with persistence, and American morale crumbled. Televised images of burning villages and flag-draped coffins turned the public against the war. Protests erupted, draft cards burned, and the nation's unity fractured. Despite military victories like the Tet Offensive, the psychological toll was immense. In 1973, the US withdrew its troops, leaving South Vietnam to fight alone. 2 years later, Saigon fell, and the country unified under communist control. Over 58,000 Americans were dead, and millions of Vietnamese civilians were caught in the crossfire. The Vietnam War changed how America viewed conflict forever. It was no longer just about winning battles, but questioning why they were fought at all. Yet even after Vietnam, the Cold War raged on, and America's next wars would be faster, sharper, and fought on an entirely different stage. The Gulf War. By 1990, the Cold War was fading, but a new threat was rising in the Middle East. Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded neighboring Kuwait, sending shockwaves across the world. The US responded swiftly, leading a coalition of 34 nations under Operation Desert Storm. It was the first major war of the satellite age, with live footage of missile strikes and precision bombing playing on TV screens worldwide. In just 6 weeks, American-led forces obliterated Iraq's military infrastructure and liberated Kuwait. The ground war lasted only 100 hours before Hussein's army retreated. US casualties were minimal compared to previous wars, marking a new era of rapid, high-tech combat. The Gulf War restored American confidence after Vietnam and showcased its dominance as the last global superpower. Yet even in victory, the seeds of future conflict were planted. Sanctions, no-fly zones, and rising resentment in the Middle East would soon lead to something far larger, a war on terror that would define the next 2 decades. The war in Afghanistan. On September 11, 2001, the world changed forever. After the terrorist attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans, President George W. Bush launched Operation Enduring Freedom, targeting al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. US and allied forces quickly dismantled the Taliban government, but the mission didn't end there. What began as a hunt for terrorists evolved into a 20-year campaign of nation-building, counterinsurgency, and endless deployments. The terrain was unforgiving, and the enemy was elusive. Roadside bombs, ambushes, and guerrilla tactics made progress painfully slow. Osama bin Laden was eventually killed in 2011 during a covert raid in Pakistan. But the war continued. By 2021, after trillions of dollars and thousands of lives lost, the United States withdrew its final troops. Within weeks, the Taliban regained control of Kabul. The longest war in American history had ended, not with victory, but exhaustion. And as troops returned home, another war was already in the headlines. One fought in the very region that had shaped modern geopolitics for decades. The Iraq War and modern American intervention. 2 years after invading Afghanistan, the United States turned its attention to Iraq. In 2003, under the claim that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, US forces launched a full-scale invasion. The Iraqi regime collapsed quickly, but the chaos that followed spiraled into years of insurgency and civil unrest. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. American troops battled militias, terrorists, and sectarian violence until their withdrawal in 2011. Yet by 2014, the rise of ISIS pulled the US back into the region, launching airstrikes and providing support to local forces. These operations blurred the lines between war and intervention. Today, the United States isn't officially at war, but it remains deeply involved in global conflicts. American forces assist Ukraine with intelligence, funding, and weapon supplies in its defense against Russia's 2022 invasion. In the Middle East, the US continues limited operations against extremist groups and provides support to Israel amid ongoing regional instability. Drone strikes, military aid, and defense pacts keep America engaged across multiple continents, even without formal declarations of war. The modern battlefield has shifted from trenches and tanks to cyber warfare, counterterrorism, and proxy conflicts. The United States may not be fighting a single great war, but its influence and responsibility still stretch worldwide. From 1775 to today, every battle has shaped the nation's role in history. And even now, the story of American warfare isn't over. It's just changed form. If you like this video, consider watching this next one, which YouTube thinks you are going to really love.